evening, everyone. Today is it's Monday, the 15th of July, 2019. What I'd like to now do is introduce Louise McDermott, and she's going to talk about Edgar Steitz. And I'm not going to even do an introduction because I don't know that much about it, but Louise does. But I'm going to hand her this device, and she'll be... Just push that, turn it on, and then forward, back, whatever. But that one turns it on.
Right, so that's on now?
It's on now, you just have to turn that.
Okay. There we are. It works. So my talk tonight's about Edgar Steitz and his family. And I'll just explain that all of this information has been gathered since January this year. Because up till then, neither I nor anyone on the MHPA committee had any knowledge of the life or family of Edgar Steitz. And it was only after we got an email from Lynn Deering at the Bayswater Historical Society asking if MHPA would be interested in a donation of some work by Edgar Steitz, an artist once resident in Maylands, that we actually had a need to know. So we did some preliminary online searching and we found enough images of his artwork to know that any of it would be a great asset for our historical society, something we would have to treasure and promote. So by the 9th of January we decided we'd accept. We made contact with Ian Fraser, who was the person who was offering these works to us, and he was offering the work to us because he was downsizing and moving to the eastern states, and he wanted these particular works to stay in Western Australia. And they had come to him not through an inheritance, they were works he'd actually bought at auction houses because he liked them and he thought they were special. So that's how he had them, and that's why he wanted them to stay in WA, because that's where the artist was from, where he'd created the works. And it was a portrait and some sculptures. And he'd been frustrated that he actually hadn't been able to find out very much about this artist. So when we saw all three of the donated works, we became even more curious about this artist. And we wrote about Edgar Steitz and his family in our February newsletter. We sent that to Ian Fraser, and he was delighted to have all this new information that he hadn't managed to find out. And we've learned a lot since then. We've had some more in our newsletter. And when we actually got these works dropped off to us in April, that gave us additional inspiration. So we're looking at Edgar Steitz and his family from 2 points of view, and in terms of 2 future exhibitions. So one is as a migration story, a story about a family migrating from Germany to Western Australia. It's a bit different from a lot of other migration stories. This isn't one, we don't know why they left Germany, we don't know why they chose to move to WA. It's not a story about finding prosperity and leaving lots of descendants, because unlike their parents, the 5 Steitz siblings were not the marrying kind. So we have no record of any of them marrying. We know of no descendants. There's a possibility there are some, but certainly none that we know of in Australia. And so, yes, so there we have the parents, Karl Ludwig and his wife Clara Theresa. And they have their 5 children. Adi is their only daughter, Hans Theodor, eldest son, obviously a bit of a gap between those 2 children. After that, they come at very regular intervals, every 2 years, another son. So Hans, then Edgar in 1885, Karl Ludwig, known as Lou, in 1887, and then Max in 1889. So it's going to be a story about a migration story, but it's also a story about creative arts Maylands, because he was a very creative person, as we'll see. So to look for information about Edgar and his family, we looked at a few different sources. We looked at Trove, which is a lovely source of digitised newspapers, and we looked at some newspapers that weren't yet on Trove. We looked at post office directories, we looked in the State Library of WA, we looked in the Art Gallery of WA. The librarian, Belinda, the librarian at the Art Gallery of WA, has been very helpful. We looked at John went to the State Record Office and looked for wills. I looked at the National Archives of Australia, and that's just a screen dump from the National Archives site. there were 17 pieces of information they held about the Steitz family, or any Steitz family. Fortunately, it's not a common name. And we could look, of the 17, about 13 appeared to relate to the people that we were looking for, and of those, some of them had already, these little booklets, I mean, they've already been digitised and they're public. And interestingly, a lot of the sources related to security, military, intelligence and police. So that made us curious to know what all that was about as well. Then, of course, we had Edgar's artwork, and we had people and organisations who knew the Steitz family or Edgar's work. And we've got two very special guests with us tonight. We've got Alan and Jean Smith. And you'll find out exactly why they're so very special later in the talk. But I can tell you that Alan helped his father cast some of Edgar's sculptures in bronze. And Jean also was working in Fremantle and knew Edgar as a window cleaner at that time. So we have two very special guests. As a window cleaner. So we're not cleaning windows, he made art. Okay. And the other thing we had it was useful, go back again, is the cemetery records. Now what you see here is a picture of the family burial plot. Yeah. And you can only see the picture. You can't go and visit it for real because it doesn't exist anymore. It's been renewed. So what we have is the picture of what it once looked like, and we have a transcription of what was on the gravestones. That's it. Some things that you think are very permanent turn out not to be. Yes, so anyway, this is the family, for whatever reason, decide to move from Hamburg to colonial Western Australia. And they come via Albany, and Carl Ludwig Sr. arrives in April 1895. And he's on his own. The family haven't arrived yet, and he gets himself into a bit of trouble. He's charged with assault in July 1895. And it's not all that serious because you can see it's headed an amusing case. And the defendant and himself were lodgers at Mrs. Welby's boarding house. And they were chatting with the other boarders when the German entered the room and commenced chaffing him about not keeping his promise to give a pair of gloves to a barmaid. When he replied he had never promised any gloves to a barmaid, Steitz then rushed at him and slapped him in the face. A Franco-German war on a small scale would probably have ensued, but a fellow lodger managed to separate them. The Frenchman said if the assault had taken place in his own country, the affair would have been settled with swords. However, it was considered that Khan had given the defendant provocation, and evidence was shown that previous to Steitz striking him, Khan had passed a remark which had greatly offended Steitz. So in the end, each side was fined 1 shilling and had to pay their own costs. So it was an assault, but it wasn't a very bad assault. And then the family, so Carl's wife and children arrived in Western Australia in 1895, and that seems to have prevented him getting into any more arguments at boarding houses. So things are looking better. Carl finds work. He's working as a he's taking orders on behalf of various printing businesses, and he's working for a couple of different firms, and he gets into trouble. He winds up being charged with embezzlement, of all things, in 1899, and that was because he had money coming in and he had money that was owed to him. So he took what was owed to him out and passed the rest on to the firm, who wanted him to have given them all the money and then claimed what was due to him back. So that was the argument, and he was charged with embezzlement, refunded the money, was discharged on entering into recognizances to be of good behaviour for 6 months. And after that, he doesn't seem to have had any more trouble with the law at all. Because the next time we see him, Australia's turned into a federation already, and the next time Carl makes the news is because he suddenly dies. And by this stage, he's a clerk, or some accounts he's an accountant, at His Majesty's Hotel. And he's found in his chair in the office in a dying condition by an employee who notifies others at the hotel. And of course, their first thought is they must administer stimulants, because they're in the hotel, they've got lots of these, so they do that, and it doesn't help. He died a few minutes after that. Post-mortem was going to be held, but it was decided that it was natural causes, no suspicious circumstances, no inquiry required. So, just go back to that one. Yep. So, They're now, the family is without the father, but things are progressing fairly well. And they've obviously integrated very well, because the funeral of Charles Ludwig Steitz was held in the Anglican portion of Karrakatta Cemetery and was largely attended. Chief mourners were, of course, the immediate family, but there were several pallbearers, Mr Daly, a Carl Fink, an H.E. Hardy and H. Sands, numerous wreaths and floral tributes from many friends. The Venerable Archdeacon Huddleston and the Reverend Edward Makeham officiated, and so he was obviously held in quite a deal of esteem by the people he'd been mixing with. And the children are growing up, so they're not very old, most of them. So Edgar's only about 8, I think Lou is only, Max is only 6 when they arrive. But they're Edgar and Lou. Carl Ludwig Jr. likes to be known as Lou. They study at Perth Tech School 1905 to 1909. They are very keen on first aid. They do St John's Adrian's classes. Edgar's winning a prize for figure drawing in 1912. Edgar gets naturalised, and he can only be naturalised as a British subject at this point. There is no category of Australian citizen, so he becomes a naturalised British subject. And Lou does that later in 1914. Max's application for naturalisation is actually rejected, so I'll come back to that. And in the meantime, the boys in the family, so Hans and Lou and Edgar and Max, are all involved in a business called Universal Window Cleaning. So Lou is the proprietor, Max is the manager, and Edgar is the manager of the Fremantle branch. And this business is going along quite well, but they have other employees as well, and one of those employees sues them for wages in 1910. So they've got all the hassles of running a small business. And Lou becomes an instructor at the YMCA. So Davolac Chambers, it has its office in, Universal Window Cleaning has an office in Davolac Chambers on the corner of Hay and Pier Streets. And then, of course, World War I breaks out. Now, Edgar doesn't have the best time. He saved up money and he travelled to Perth to do further study in 1913. And he went to the Royal College of Art at Kensington in the UK. Then he visited Hamburg and Munich and Zurich and Lausanne and Bern. And he had an aunt that he was visiting in Hamburg. And he had been in Germany, gone down to Switzerland. It's a pity he didn't stay there for the duration of the war. But you've got to remember, in 1914, people had no idea that the war would actually impact as heavily as it did on civilians. They thought they would be allowed to go about their normal business. So Edgar comes back from Switzerland to Hamburg, spends time with the aunt. Then he tries to get a boat to New York. Now, the United States is a neutral country at the stage of the war, but Edgar doesn't get to board that boat. He's interned with a lot of other British subjects and 80 Australians, including 3 from WA. And you can see he's writing back, so that this fact that people are being interned is newsworthy, so it's making the papers, and that the whole list of Australian names are being printed. And Edgar himself writes to the Perth YMCA to say he's been arrested after taking his ticket for New York. So he's intended to spend a year or 2 studying in England and Germany, and winds up having quite a different experience. But at this stage, remember, early days of the war, people thought it might all be over by Christmas. Didn't happen that way. Now, the place where Edgar gets locked up is actually the Berlin equivalent of the Gloucester Park trolley track. And this happens because no one has really made any plans about interning people. But in the autumn of 1914, the British government decided to intern a great number of Germans in Great Britain. And that's they had 26,000 Germans in Great Britain, so they all got locked up. And after that, in retaliation of this British action against German nationals, the German government arranges for British citizens residing in Germany to be rounded up and interned. And this happens on the 6th of November 1914. A German government decree rules that all male British subjects, except clergymen, doctors, lunatics, and those with disabilities between the age of 17 and 50 should be taken to an internment camp, of which the Ruhleben camp outside on the edge of Berlin, in the Spandau area, was one. And they were interning British civilian men who up to this time had enjoyed comparative freedom in Berlin and other cities of Europe. And there was no planning. No preparations had been made. They had to put these people somewhere. So they had this trotting track with 3 grandstands and a series of horse boxes. So they marched the internees in, they put them 6 to a horse box, and when the boxes were full, they put them up in the haylofts, and they had people of all ages and backgrounds. And they had, it's getting to be winter, this is November in Berlin, it's getting cold, they've got 1 blanket each, and they've got some straw. So it's a bitterly cold winter. But within days, they had organised a football tournament and played it. And after 9 months, they'd organised themselves so much that they were able to persuade the German guards to withdraw from the camp, leaving the prisoners to run themselves. They had football leagues, cricket leagues, a school, a theatre, an orchestra of 70 musicians, a camp magazine, and that's the camp magazine. And so this place is quite well known, well documented in museums in the UK and in Canada. Not much, quite as well known in Australia. They had a post office, they had a parcel post office, they had their own police force. They had this sort of little British colony in the middle of Berlin. They even had a Ruhleben branch of the Royal Horticultural Society. And they raised 52 different varieties of sweet pea. And they had international footballers, they had Davis Cup tennis players, they had physicists, all sorts of people. They founded political parties, they had an election in 1915, and the candidate who won campaigned on a promise to import women into the camp. Very popular. He may have got elected, that didn't happen. One of the internees who'd been a student working in Germany, working with Hans Geiger, a man named James Chadwick, was interned for the whole of the war. He recorded the cold and the cramped accommodation in the barracks, but he converted part of his space into a little lab to continue his studies. And after he discovered the neutron, he got the 1935 prize for physics, so he didn't waste his time in the camp or anywhere else. The horse trainers got released because the Kaiser's horses needed attention. A fire broke out in 1917, the prisoners extinguished it, and some of the guards did a bit of looting. They did a Christmas production of The Messiah with a full orchestra and chorus. Prisoners delivering parcels found some very obliging ladies in Berlin, and some people dropped out of escape plans because they were in a play. But it was still a place that we were locked up in, you couldn't get out. One man wrote in the Western Mail, it was a person from the eastern states of Australia writing to his brother in Fremantle, said, "Everything about the camp is done by the prisoners, and the material either sent from home or bought at high prices from outside. The camp rented the racecourse, cultivated about half of it as a vegetable garden, and laid out the other as a sports ground, where, according to the season, rugby, football, lacrosse, baseball and golf are played. There are, I think, 19 excellently well-kept tennis courts. But in the course of the long years, we have got used to and tired and wearied of everything, mud and dirt and cold in winter, and fine sandstorms and heat all summer, the sand mixed with filth and expectoration from lately over 4,000 people." So they might have been comfortable with 2,000 people in this camp. They had 4,000 to 5,000 people for most of the time. To know what that means, one must experience being locked up in about 8 acres of land, surrounded by barbed wire and bayonets without a change of faces, and at no time with liberty to go out, cooking tin foods, etc., doing one's own washing and mending, and many other objectionable things. The poor people who still remain there are suffering acutely, and when sickness is added, they are surely in the nethermost hell. So that was Ruhleben, and that's where Edgar spent World War I. So meanwhile, and generally the Australian newspapers were quite sympathetic to the people who'd been interned there, everybody except Perth Sunday Times. In 1918 it wrote, "Some of the Australians interned in Ruhleben Camp, Germany, belong to the fine old Anglo-Saxon families." It listed a whole lot of Germanic names, including Steitz. "And they want the Commonwealth Government to send them comforts, presumably sauerkraut and leberwurst for preference, at the rate of £1 per head per week, 9. So as far as the Sunday Times was concerned, these people could starve. But they actually were getting comforts sent in. The government was paying for parcels to come from Harrods for a while, and then through a central comforts fund. And understandably, Edgar later applied for reparation from the Civilian War Claim Board. Meanwhile, back in Perth. So Edgar's off, gone over to Europe to study. His brothers Lou and Max are doing good work with regard to first aid classes at the YMCA. Now, again, people are getting interned in Australia, so go back. Yeah, some Germans are interned on Rottnest Island, and the conditions on Rottnest are considered so bad that the Commonwealth Government insists it be closed down, and people are transferred to other camps, mainly in New South Wales. Now, so Lou had already been naturalised, and Max, as I said, applied for naturalisation and got knocked back. And they had a window cleaning business. He had character references, notables in Perth, but a window cleaner that they had sacked reported that Max had made remarks defamatory of the King and the Empire. And that meant Max's file got marked application not to be progressed. So he wasn't allowed to become naturalised on that basis. And his mother and his big brother Hans have to register as enemy aliens. They have to report to the police every week. And so is Max, reporting to the police every week. What happens to the big sister, I don't know. She doesn't seem to be on the official records. And in 1916, now Lou had been very involved with the YMCA. He'd been part of their Harriers Run Club. He'd been trying to wake up an interest in the Drafts Club. He'd been a speaker at the Mother's Day function. He was involved in Busy Bees at the Black Boy Hill camp. He was busy with first aid classes there. He was the instructor for practical first aid. And he was on the committee for the Harriers. And then, May, June 1916, the Battle of Jutland. Lou has been doing first aid classes for the police, and he's asked to stop doing that. No one wants a person with a German name working with the police anymore. So, and there were allegations that Lou was pro-German, but these couldn't be substantiated by the security services. They investigated. There was no substance. He was just unfortunate enough to have a German name. So 1920s, Edgar gets back to Perth in 1924. Now, it's not easy for Edgar to get back to Perth. You can imagine at the end of the war, there's not a lot of shipping spare. The Australian government wants to bring home all its troops first. And so it's low priority. He starts asking for permission to come home in 1920. He doesn't get home till 1924. And the West Australian Commissioner of Police says, well, he went to Germany in 1913. He's been there ever since. It's not beyond doubt that he fought against the Allies, or at least that his action or his sympathies were with our enemies. The poor man's been locked up in an internment camp for 4 years. Before he can come back, there are all these questions about, did he intend to come back to Australia when he left, back in 1913? Now, I can't really understand this. He's been locked up, the Australian government's been contributing to his keep. Suddenly they're not sure whether he's worth bringing home or not. And whatever your intentions might have been in 1913, if you'd been locked up for 4 years, you might be very happy to shake the dust of the whole place off your feet and go a long way back to your own home. But, and then one of the other security concerns was, I said, well, after the outbreak, he went from Germany to Switzerland and then back to the aunt in Hamburg. And this could not be the action of a loyal British subject. His readmittance to Australia is not advisable. However, testimony from Archdeacon Huddleston, who'd been officiating at Edgar's father's funeral, and Sergeant Smith of the WA Police, that he was a good citizen and would be in acquisition, helped. Archdeacon Huddleston also spoke to the Minister for Defence about the family, who said we're a very good character and very attached to each other. So Edgar did actually make it back to WA in 1924. In the meantime, he'd picked up some work in a painting and decoration business in Brussels. He'd been to Rotterdam, he'd visited London. His language skills were developed to the point where he was conversing with Dutch, Flemish, German, French, Italian and Esperanto. So he comes home, and I think that experience of being locked up in the camp with people from all over the bits of the British Empire. So there were people from, England, Scotland and Wales, there were people from Canada, there were people from Australia, there were people from Jamaica. I think he became very Australian as a result of that experience. And he's certainly one of the people who enters the 1927 Australian stamp design competition relating to what was then the new Parliament House in Canberra. And his design is an artwork of Parliament House flanked by a kangaroo and emu in pencil, crimson ink and Chinese white. So things are looking up, but the big sister, Adie, dies, and she was living by then with her mother at 76 Zabina Street, Norwood. That's one of these streets that stays the same, and they changed the name of the suburb around it. So Norwood then became Mount Lawley, and now that street's regarded as being in East Perth. It's between the Banks Reserve and the railway, and the family were living there from 1921 to 1933. Max also came back to Australia in 1928. Now, Max has to travel as a German national because he was not allowed to become a naturalised British subject. So he regards himself as a German. He's at this Esperanto conference. Yeah, here. That's Max, the third one, the tall one. And he's a German representative at that conference. Okay, so we get to the 1933, and finally we get a collection happening with Maylands. It hasn't happened until then. And there's a building permit issued for Peninsula for a brick residence in Caledonian Avenue, at cost of £600 for M. Steitz, which would have been Max in May 1933. But if it was intention to move the whole family there, well, their mother Clara doesn't make it. She dies in July 3, 1933 at Mount Lawley in Zabina Street. However, she's 80 years old, so she's done fairly well. And she's outlived her husband and her one and only daughter. And so there's the plaque, the gravestone read, "Our dearly beloved mother, Therese Clara Sophia Steitz." However, so she's dead, she's buried, we have the gravestone. The Post Office Directory don't quite catch up. So they record Mrs. T. Steitz living at 62 Caledonian Avenue in 1934 and 35. Not possible, but doesn't matter. And then Hans, the eldest son, is recorded as living there from 36 through to 1949. Let's have a look at Max. Max obviously didn't get put off by the unfortunate ending to Edgar's European travels. So Max goes travelling himself, and his timing isn't really terribly good either. He winds up in Madrid during the Revolution, and he's giving, this is from an article he did for a West Australian newspaper. He studied Spanish and Esperanto. He'd been teaching languages in Madrid, and he does this article about the details of murder and rapine in war-wrecked Spain. And he's been recently a professor, and 2 years ago. So he's talking about the revolution in Madrid, and he's also talking about the improvement in living conditions in Germany. So he'd been living in Spain, Germany, and other European countries. And when Max gets back to Perth, he doesn't immediately rush to become part of the family window cleaning business again. Max is very proud of his qualifications. He's proud that he was a professor at this college near Madrid, and he's trying to teach, make a living from the things he knows, from teaching German, Spanish, Esperanto and bookkeeping. And you can see from the ads that he offered all of these. Bookkeeping tended to be the one that obviously had most success. So it doesn't look like the people of Perth had much interest in learning German or Spanish or Esperanto. Meanwhile, Edgar is getting together his first solo art exhibition. And it's at Newspaper House, which was the venue for art exhibitions at the time. And you can see he's doing pencil sketches, and he's doing oils, and he's also doing some sculptures. And the pencil sketches he's pricing at 5 guineas. He's doing landscapes of Belmont and Holland and portraits, and the portraits are priced at 25 guineas. There are lots of things that are just listed as portrait of a native, but there are also some of particular persons. And these appear to be newsworthy Aboriginal persons, Watty, Don and Nipper, and we'll come back to those later on. So we've got favourable reviews. Lovers of the fine arts are reminded that Mr. E. Steitz will close his exhibition of sculptures, portraitures, paintings and casting from life, including the study of King Billy, cast in bronze by Mr. P.W. Smith. Now that's the father of the Smith that we have here, Alan Smith that we have here today. And Alan was also involved in some of the casting process.
That video there is when the other class students that man
with the round face, yep. So I'll go through, I'll show the people some of the pictures you brought at the end, I think. I'll just keep going through this. And so he was highly praised by experts of this state, and he was sort of classed among the other well-known artists then working in Perth. So that was people like John Barker and Margaret Johnson, J.A.B. Linton, Amy Heap, Irene Carter, people like that. So he's doing quite well. But then we get World War II coming, and that brings a whole lot more stress and suspicion, even more than there was in World War I. Now remember, Australia's been so paranoid about Germans that actually suspended immigration from Germany in the interwar period as well. So Hans is recorded as living at 62 Caledonian Avenue, and he was, the whole family again being suspected of being anti-British or pro-German. And the reasons for this are fairly spurious. One of the reasons was that they had a cowbell as the doorbell at 62 Caledonian Avenue. That was considered suspicious enough for the police to investigate. And there was wire on the windows. So the police asked Lou, why is this happening? He said, look, his brother Hans had been living there and he was crippled and he feared being attacked, so he'd put the wire on the windows then. And at this stage, Lou was living in Caledonian Avenue, and Edgar's actually living in rooms in Davolac Chambers in Pearce Street and spending all his spare time working at his art, painting and modelling. And the police keep getting asked to investigate. So in 1939, the Special Bureau report that there don't seem to be any cause to believe that either Lou or Edgar are anti-British, as all the information about them has been in their favour. 1940, no anti-British sentiments. Sympathetic to the German people generally, but definitely anti-Hitler and bitter towards his Napoleonic tendencies. Some of their views have been misunderstood. So the security services are actually being very measured in their response to all of these allegations that they get. And the allegations get a bit wilder. Edgar gets accused of possessing a Morse code key. He gets accused of looking at plans of what must be strategic locations. He gets accused of being subversive and engaged in small factory on munitions. Now that's actually going to visit your father's factory in Fremantle, where he was storing his window cleaning equipment. And that was what the police discovered. Because he'd been storing window cleaning equipment, ladders, wheelbarrows, in the Fremantle Engineering Munitions Works of Dorothy Smith, 15 Essex Street, and Smith was also a modeller and an art student, and Steitz spent a lot of time with him at his place in Essex Street. So there's nothing suspicious in there, but there's a whole lot of paranoia happening. So more of this is being directed at Lou than at Edgar, but window cleaners are coming in for suspicion. They might be overhearing things. They might be learning about shipping information. They might be doing something else. So the police investigate that, and they say there's nothing. Edgar's writing this out rather better than Lou, because they'd had very different experiences during the First World War. And Lou begins to feel that he's being persecuted by what he calls the criminal gangs of Maylands, and by 1941 he thinks he's also being spied on by the Girls' Friendly Society, under the direction of the Dean of Perth. So Lou is actually losing the plot. His mental health is really deteriorating pretty drastically. And officials from the police and the Defence Department try to persuade Lou that he is not being persecuted. But they say that his mental health is definitely failing, and he becomes unbalanced. He winds up in the Heathcote Mental Hospital, and the police are saying he's unbalanced. His furtive actions have given rise to these further allegations. But by 1944 he was back cleaning windows in Forest Place, but still not mentally sound, no friends nor associates. And the other thing that happened in 1944, and I didn't know this until I started this research, was that there was a 1940 National Security change of name regulation. And that said that an enemy alien or a person of enemy origin shall not carry on any trade or business under a trade name unless that name include the surname by which he is ordinarily known on the date of his arrival in Australia or the 31st of December 1932, whichever is later. And that meant you couldn't be universal window cleaning anymore. They'd been universal window cleaning since, fairly early on in the turn of the century. They now had to become universal window cleaning Steitz or be prosecuted. And the only reason for making people tag a family name on like that is to enable discrimination. So it's fanning this sort of thing. It's not closing anything down. The other reason they were getting investigated was, of course, because they had a brother living in Spain. and Max was considered to have definite pro-German sympathies. But the correspondence wasn't very frequent. 1939, Max writes, "Dear brother, I have not heard from you. I am very busy that I cannot accept all the pupils. I really want 36 hours a day." And in 1942, there's a Christmas card from Edgar. So there's not a very frequent correspondence, but that's still enough to cause all of this hassle. However, Edgar has still got a fairly nationalist orientation, and he does a bust of Prime Minister Curtin for presentation to him. He also tries to sell copies of this bust. He suggests that every council in WA might like to buy a copy for their council chambers. I don't think that went very well. However, we've also spoken to, had contact with a person who lived in Davilat Chambers at this time, and he remembers Prime Minister Curtin coming to sit for a portrait by Edgar Steitz. So with all of this business about national security, clearly the Prime Minister wasn't worried at all. So I think that puts it into perspective. And again, he's being referred to as, Mr. Edgar Steitz of Perth. He's considered to be a West Australian artist, so not actually putting the German label onto Edgar and his art at all. And at one stage, Edgar was also doing work with the council stables, trying to do studies of a horse in bronze, a horse that he wanted to cast in bronze for an exhibition at Newspaper House later. So he has a 1947 exhibition, and at Newspaper House. The work of Mr. E. Steitz, who studied in Europe and England for some years but has long been a resident of this state. And again, there's sculpture and portraiture. Edgar considers himself a sculptor. That's what he puts on his passport. That's his occupation. Not window cleaner, not painter, sculptor. And the sculptures there, the prices have gone up nicely by now. So the sculptures are about 50 to 350 guineas. So he's charging a good price. One of his sculptures is of General Monash, and again we have bronze cast by Mr. P.W. Smith. So this is all very important. So it gets favourable reviews, and he gets some interesting letters to the editor in the newspapers. One from Art Lover. It said, "May I, as a recent arrival from the Eastern States, congratulate West Australia on the high standard of art as it is revealed in the exhibition of the works of Mr. E. Steitz. Mr. Steitz, I am informed, was one of the first art students to enrol as a boy at the Perth Technical College, where he laid the foundation for a successful art career, the fruits of which must now gladden the hearts of all who cooperated with him in his youthful studies. West Australia should be proud of this artist's excellent work, as it shows much genius and training. His native studies will certainly live, and as a sculptor he indeed stands high. The public, I'm sure, would like to see more of his excellent work." So Edgar seems to be flourishing, Lou's in diabolical trouble, but Lou actually turns to religion. So by the 1950s, Lou is publishing a meditation on the Lord's Prayer, and you can go and read this for yourself in the State Library. So it's just the cover and the 2 pages. And he's also involved in spiritualist church activities. So the Mr. Steitz mentioned these church notices at the Spiritualist Church in Caledonian Avenue, Maylands, and at Leaderville does appear to be Lou rather than Edgar. But to start with, we weren't sure, but there's a fairly good reason to be sure that it is. So Lou looks like he's recovering his mental health quite well. However, Lou dies in 1962. And again, one of the reasons we're quite sure it was Lou involved with the Spiritualist Church is one of the death notices is in memory of brother from all the members and friends of the Mayland Spiritualist Church. So that's what Lou is involved with. He's still got his brothers Edgar and Max put up a tombstone in loving memory of our loved brother Karl Ludwig Steitz, passed away 22nd June 62, aged 75 years. And Lou has made a will, and that says, "Karl Ludwig Steitz, cleaner of 62 Caledonian Avenue, Maylands, WA, I give, devise and bequeath unto my brothers, Hans T. Steitz, who had died by then, Edgar T. L. Steitz, Max T. Steitz, all my real and personal estate, to be equally divided among them." So at that stage, Edgar's really favourably inclined to all of his brothers. He doesn't update the will. The Steitz family were not at all good at making wills. John McLennan went off to the State Records Library to look for wills relating to the Steitz family. He only found 2. That's one of them. The other one was Edgar's. So that's what's happening. Now, what's Edgar doing in the 1950s? Well, apart from the family business, he's found what he thinks is an art treasure that's gone missing from the Vatican. It's something he picked up cheaply at a sale, recognised it as a true work of art, and wrote to the Pope expressing his willingness to sell the picture back to the Vatican. I think he wanted £3,000 for it, and the Vatican wasn't terribly interested. But the article about this find of Edgar's goes on to talk about the astonishing assortment of artwork of all varieties, valued in all at several £1,000s, cluttering the entire interior of Mr. Steitz's home. And it also mentions that he's regarded by some as one of the most brilliant craftsmen in his field in the Commonwealth. So that's fairly high praise. So the next one, however, by the 1960s, and this is our friend the Sunday Times again, so it's, the headline there says, "He guards his treasures with a sword in the house of ghosts." And the first paragraph says, 3,000 soundless voices maintain an eerie silence in a locked, barred and lonely house of ghosts in Caledonian Avenue, Maylands. Inside, a solitary old man, Mr. Edgar Steitz, guards his statue and his paintings with a 4-foot sword that he had made himself. So, and there's Edgar with the sword. So, again, by this stage, he's not showing he's maybe making art, but certainly it's all staying at his place. So Edgar dies in 1966, and he doesn't die at 62 Caledonian Avenue, which Lou did. He dies at his home, 182 Swan Street, Mount Yokine. And it's with also the... he was a sincere friend of Erica and Bob Plucht. And you can see there's also the death notice says, "Memories always of a dear friend from Des, Gwen and the boys." And one that says, "Goodbye, Mr. Steitz, Brian." Now, that makes a bit more sense when you look at Edgar's will, which he made in 1965. "I, Edgar Ludwig Theodore Steitz, of 62 Caledonian Avenue, Maylands, hereby revoke all former wills. I appoint Bob van der Kloot, hereafter called my trustee, of 182 Swan Street, Mount Yokine, in the said state, automobile electrician, to be executor and trustee of this my will. I give and bequeath free of all probate and other, if any, duties payable upon or by reason of my death, to Gan Kirk and Brian Kirk, both of 36 Herbert Street, Maylands, aforesaid the sum of £250, each if and when they respectively attain the age of 21 years, provided that if they or other of them have not at the date of my death attained the age, their respective legacies shall be invested by my trustee in the manner authorised by law for the investment of trust money, and the said legatee, upon their respectively attaining the said age, will beneficially take the accumulated income on their respective legacies. And subject to the payment of my debts, funeral and testamentary expenses, all probate and other, if any, duties payable on or by reason of my death, I give, devise and bequeath all the rest and residue of my estate, both real and personal, whatsoever and wheresoever, to the said Bob van der Kloot, as to freeholds in fee simple and personal estate absolute for his use and benefit." So Max is completely out of the picture. And as far as we know, Max never returned to Western Australia. Not for Lou's death, not for Edgar's death. For Edgar's death, there was a notice in the paper that said Max in Spain. And again, not Max and family, not Max and wife, just Max. So it's still solitary. So, Edgar's now little remembered as an artist, and that sort of happened with the art community's comment on his death. Painter and sculptor Edgar Steitz died in Perth this week, aged 81. He came to WA at the age of 9 from Hamburg, Germany, and studied art in Perth and London. In his later years, he lived in seclusion in Maylands, surrounded by thousands of examples of his paintings, sculptures and craft work. Photographs of his work reveal him as a competent academic artist who was particularly interested in the Australian Aborigines as a subject. And it's quite noticeable that the Art Gallery of WA has no work by Edgar Steitz. We have more Edgar Steitz works at the MHPA than the Art Gallery of WA has. So that's quite interesting. So going on to the next one. So what is the legacy of this family from the migration story, from the art side of things? Well, from the migration story, they've left traces behind themselves in records. There's really not much other evidence of this family. Edgar's works of art may have a longer and more permanent legacy to the country with which he identified. I've just given you some of the examples here. Now, the plaque on the left is a plaque of Roberta Jull, and it hangs over the entrance to the Jull Common Room at St Catherine's College in UWA, and it was a commissioned work. So Roberta Jull died in 1961, and it looks like Edgar signed the actual his bit of the plaque in 1955. So he's still getting commissions for that style of work at that stage. And I'm very grateful to Lou Cartwright, the Projects and Prism Coordinator at St Catherine's College, UWA, who took this lovely photo. So I went out there with my little phone to take a picture. The plaque's up over the doorway. I didn't really want to stand on the furniture, but Lou saw what I was doing, came back with her much better camera, had no hesitation, retrieving chairs from the common room, putting them together, stood up, got right up there and took this very lovely image of the plaque for us. Now the other one is one of our works that we now hold. At auction it was described as Portrait of an Aboriginal Man. Now it looks like a portrait of a very particular person, but we don't know at this stage who that person is. And it may be from one of his exhibited works. But I'd just like to show you the two sculptures that we have. Now, the picture on the left is the one that Ian Fraser sent us before we'd actually seen the works for ourselves. So it looked very interesting. You can get an idea of it's quite a small piece. Now, it's also quite a fragile piece because these are made of plaster over white. So they're fragile, they'd be easily damaged. And they're quite beautiful. You can see in the middle part, that's just a more detailed image of the one on the left-hand side. And the third piece we've got is also small, and it's of a seated figure. So MHPA is still trying to understand and appreciate Edgar's artwork and their significance, and their need for care and the way we can best and most safely display them. But I think one of the ways to understand Edgar's art is to see him as a nationalist, in the fact that he was choosing to do images of Curtin and General Monash and of the Parliament House in Canberra, and images of Australia's First Peoples. And that's actually why I chose to use Australia's national sporting colours, green and gold, for the background of this presentation. His sculptures are not simply ethnographic or anthropological records. They're not kitsch. They are beautiful works from a skilled artist. MHPA is very, very privileged to hold this work, in my opinion. So thank you. Are there any questions?
You mentioned the study in Spain, Esplanade, but it was to be an international language, and I don't think it really took off, but I just couldn't find out something you want to do something about it.
No, but obviously when Max came back, he was the German representative at an Esperanto conference in Perth in that interwar period. And I think it was one of the responses to World War I, that people thought if there was a common language, perhaps we would never get into that sort of horrible mess and muddle and war ever again. So it was born out of hope. But yes, it obviously wasn't sufficient to overcome the problems it was hoping to address, or to become an easy way for people to communicate.
And of course this building here, prior to World War I, was a German embassy and a club. Some people might know that. Thank you.
There's also an interesting article in one of the early days, the Journal of the Royal WA Historical Society, about German cultural clubs, and also there was a Nazi club briefly in Perth in the interwar years as well. There was a Nazi club. But I said yeah, we'll talk more about that some other time. But the Steitz brothers were not involved in those activities. You can see from the very thorough police investigations that they really were not being terribly pro-German or anti-British at any point in their existence here in WA.
I think out of this talk, Marie Louise, you've now become the authority on Edgar Steitz. I don't know that there's anybody in Western Australia, anybody in the world who would put together what you have done, and John as well, with regard to researching, not hearsay, not the words from other people, other than we've got Alan and Sheen. That's the only stories that we've had by word of mouth, people telling stories. The rest of it is all documentation that we've found. It's very precious to have you be able to put some life and some connection.
And Alan has also brought along some other pictures of work by Edgar Steitz. So you can see just how lovely these things were.
Hopefully we'll get these blown up and we'll get those digitised and we can add those to the display.
But I was just looking, this is a folder of things we got from the library at the Art Gallery of WA. And this folder here is just part of the information that we're getting from the National Archives. So it's great, thick, heavy stuff, and there's a lot of stuff in there. And what I want to do probably in the next week or so is go back to the National Archives and look at the documents where Clara and her son Hans applied for registrations. I think you even get to see fingerprints on those documents. So I'd like to see them, I'd like to understand the circumstances. Some cases it was so bad, so prejudiced here in WA, that people were applying for register as enemy aliens in the hopes that they would be kept in a safe jail or a place of security because there was so much hatred and being directed at them. So again, I'd just like to see what their documents say. It might tell me something also about the daughter that I can't find out anything more about. I don't know whether she was... she arrived in Australia at about aged 18. She didn't marry in an era when most women did. I don't know whether she had some health issue or whether the mother had a health issue. Clearly the brother, Hans, is considered to be crippled, whatever that means by the 1930s. Whether that was something lifelong, I don't know. So all of those questions, you don't get information about that in the sources we've been using. So we've got to try some others.
Yeah, wonderful. I'd like to present you with a red, white or a chocolate.
I have instructions to accept the chocolate.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you
wonderful.
very much.